So I've been just starting out with people, just like having them kind of like introduce themselves and kind of maybe give us, the introductory of like when you first, you know, saw them. Did you meet them or see them first?
I met them first
Okay.
at a donut shop.
Okay. Yeah. So why don't you introduce yourself and then tell us about that?
Okay, my name is Maggie Vale, and I grew up in Olympia, Washington. I first met Carp at the Winchell's Donuts, probably about 2 a.m. in Lacey. I was with my sister, and I was driving her home, and I was home from spring break at college. I went away to Bellingham for a year after high school, and which was a total disaster. But I met Scott, Chris, and Jared that night at the Winchell's. And they thought I was older than Toby, which is funny because she's 5 years older than me. But I didn't see Carp until probably 2 or 3 months after that. They were playing a show in the Red House basement. It was a benefit for my friend Natalie's cat that had gotten shot. I don't even know how that happened, but it survived. And that was the night I met Natalie for the first time. She's my best friend and has been for 15 years, and the first night I saw Carp. So it was monumental.
And what was your impression of them there at the Winchells?
Um, they were just complete goofballs. I mean, they were just cracking jokes and, doing skits with their donuts. I don't know, it's something completely ridiculous. It felt like another world that I didn't really belong in, but seemed really interesting. I was glad to eventually pierce that shield a little.
And then what about like first impressions of the band?
That show in particular was really amazing. I mean, they were sharing one microphone, Jared and Chris. And those were always my favorite Carp moments. And it was also before Scott had a double bass drum, but could emulate the sound of a double bass drum, which was equally exciting to me. It was a fantastic show. I remember they played in Goddard Silo, but I don't remember anyone else.
So why were the single microphones your favorite?
Because they were sort of fighting for the microphone, which was good. It just made it more energetic, more exciting.
And explain what you mean about, you said emulating.
Well, he always, I mean, when I got to know Scott and when I got to know them, and I mean, I guess you kind of already always knew he wanted to have a double bass drum, just based on what they were playing and the kind of music that he loved. But it was so cool that he was able to use his floor tom and his bass drum in this way that made it sound like he was playing a double bass. And it was so impressive, that I actually got really mad at him when he got the double bass. I was like, that's such a cop-out. You don't need that. But
Did he talk about wanting a double bass?
oh, yeah, all the time. All the time. Yeah, he was...
I'm gonna cut myself out.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, he talked about wanting a double bass all the time. It was something we talked about very often until it actually happened.
So initially, if you could explain like why didn't he just? Because I get the idea that you're talking about he developed this thing out of necessity because he didn't have the bass drum for a really long time.
Right. It actually probably wasn't a really long time. In my brain, I sort of imagined it was a really long time, but it's probably like 3 months. When you're 19, a long time seems so short.
So why do you think he didn't have one like initially?
I don't know. I think perhaps he couldn't afford a double bass initially, and I think he did have some reservations about moving on. But once he did it, he was completely sold.
What would those reservations be?
Well, I think he thought it was kind of cool that he could do those sounds with the floor tom and the bass drum.
This is totally an aside, but Bert said I interviewed Bert Bergen.
Mm-hmm.
He said the funniest thing that I hadn't heard anybody else say was that Scott, he was talking about his love for Dale Crover or whatever.
Yeah.
And he was like, I remember sitting in class and he'd be like playing the solos, like with his fingers up and clicking with his teeth.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Like all these weird sounds and he was just staring at it.
He was a crazy teeth grinder too. So yeah, that makes sense that he would play drums with his teeth.
So this is gonna seem dumb, but I've been having everybody do this. Just like kind of answering the question, what is Carp? Or what was Carp?
What was Carp?
Yeah.
What was Carp? Carp. Oh God, where could I take this? Carp was I don't know, 3 boys that met at Tumwater High School and you know, united out of necessity. I mean, that's what it seems like to me. Best friends.
I talked over that, but, okay, and so then who is Carp? Who was Carp?
Carp was Jared, Chris, and Scott. And I think sort of Ruben was an honorary member.
Oh, can you explain who Ruben is in relation to them?
Ruben took their photos, and Ruben often was their roadie on tour, and I think he sort of mediated some drama sometimes between the band.
Yeah, maybe you can talk about that for a second. Like, how did you feel like he fit into like their little microcosm?
I think he's equally quick on his feet. With his humor, and I think that was absolutely necessary to be part of that group.
I'm sure that was an absolute requirement.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I remember when I started this project, I was a little bit like, because like, I knew Jared and I knew Chris, and I was a little bit like, though at the same time, like, oh my God, I'm not as smart as them.
Yeah.
You know, like they're
so
like
quick.
And the wit is really quick, and it's also directed to you, and sometimes it's mean.
Yes.
So
yeah.
you're like.
Yeah. Totally.
But they were totally nice. Didn't
Yes, I would imagine so.
So, how would you describe their music to someone who has no prior information?
Really bad at describing music, which is ridiculous because that's been my job for 15 years or so. Especially hard for me if I really care about a band. To sum it all up into one thing. I mean, it's loud, it's Northwest, it's the woods, it's the anger of being a teenage boy in a redneck town. You know, it's sort of liberating. I don't know.
Yeah, what kind of, like, when you listen to, like, and you go see the shows, like, what kind of feelings would it evoke?
I would just totally freak out. I mean, I would just go crazy, dancing and screaming and, you know, yelling for them to play out my favorite songs. And I remember my friend Kai would always put his head right up to the amp, right up to the bass speaker, and would just sit there the whole show, just staring at the band. You know, like getting the physical feeling, the sensation.
So, was there a big physical, like, quality to
absolutely
seeing them play?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, you know, you'd feel it sort of rumbling. It was always way too loud. It was always in a basement, way too loud. Of course, no one ever used earplugs then. You know, and it was always this communal Olympia thing. I mean, at the time I started seeing Carp, they were really popular. So every show would be totally packed. You know, everybody would be going nuts.
Could you describe, like, what maybe just kind of really generally what Olympia just as a town is like?
At the time or Olympia now?
No.
At the time?
Back
okay.
then, yeah.
Olympia...
I mean, actually, even if you wanted to put it into context of, like, in the early 90s. Or,
right, okay.
Yeah.
Well, in the early 90s, Olympia had a really vibrant and super strong music community. I mean, I think it still does now, but it was really special. And I don't know if that's because I was young at the time and it was that perfect moment for me, or that it was actually one of those strange microcosms that just, you know, works. Everybody sort of lived either in the Martin Apartments or in a punk house, you know, the Lucky 7 house, the Central house, the Puget house. You know, there were shows happening all the time. Everyone was extremely supportive of each other. I remember the first week I started working at Kill Rock Stars. The first 2 records I worked on were Heavens to Betsy and New Plastic Ideas. And I remember going home with my copy of New Plastic Ideas. It was just like maybe the day it came out. And everybody in the Martin, I lived in the Martin at the time, everyone in the Martin had gotten their copies too, either at the record store or for free through the band or whatever. And I remember hearing it coming out of 4 apartments that day, and it was what was on everyone's, the tip of their tongue. Everyone was talking about it. People were influencing each other and vice versa. I mean, it was just a really fertile, exciting time. I'm sure part of it was being in the shadow of, grunge and like Nirvana getting so absolutely huge. I mean, obviously Olympia was happening before that because Nirvana was playing all the time, at the North Shore Surf Club. But there was something that just really ramped it up even more. There were more people coming to town. And more people coming to town means more people, a larger percentage of them will be interesting and creative. And, there were some people that didn't really contribute much, but mostly it was, a pretty exciting time.
Yeah, how do you feel like Olympia compares or relates to what was going on in Seattle at that time?
Oh, it was totally different. Olympia was totally different than Seattle. I feel like there was a very conscious effort to, not be the next big thing, to not, be this huge, like, breakthrough band. I mean, there was probably some fantasies of that, but for the most part, it was like, let's create this alternate sort of world where we can all play music for each other and go on tour and see the world, and we don't necessarily have to, get so big that we freak out and shoot ourselves. I mean, we all, most of us knew Kurt in some way or another, even if it was just like passing at shows. And I think that was pretty traumatic for the people that did. It was like, look at what can happen to you. Let's live outside of that world.
So are you saying it's like a little less commercial?
Yeah, absolutely. It was less commercial. I mean, I worked at Kill Rock Stars, and we were very, very anti, corporate sort of. We didn't do any, magazine ads in certain magazines, or, our bands oftentimes wouldn't talk to big national glossy publications. There was a very strong will to exist outside of things at that moment. And I think that probably led to a really vibrant community.
Because you're kind of talking about investment more like, inside rather than out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the focus was on keeping our community strong. I mean, there was a lot of talk about community. Some of it good, some of it bad, but it existed, and it was there to support everyone.
So maybe you could just kind of rattle off some of the bands that were going on at that time in the early 90s.
Well, there was, Unwound and Bikini Kill, Bratmobile, Fits of Depression. Oh my God, well, how can I blank this out? There was all these people that I didn't really know very well, but that played shows all the time. And here's where I get nervous. Sorry. let me rethink the bands. I really blanked.
Skip to something else for a second too.
Okay.
Because I wanted to ask you as well if you could kind of talk about the late 80s just for a second, like the period of time that kind of predates
right.
the early 90s. I
wasn't personally a part of the scene in the late 80s. I was still in high school, and I was going through my rebellious stage where I was a cheerleader because I have punk parents. So that was my reality. That's how I rebelled. But my sister was going to shows, and I was kind of always paying attention to what she was doing. And it seemed like things were pretty, I guess that's being between like the Tropicana and the Uncola time period. It seemed like there was some good shows still happening, but maybe just not the amazing community that happened later. But maybe it was.
So, just from your kind of like impression, what do you think was different about what was going on in Olympia in the late 80s, and maybe who the bands were then? And if you could mention that that the late '80s or that time period, that'd be great.
Okay. But I don't really know. I guess I don't really know that time period very well.
Well, what about is that like, because it's kind of been my understanding that that's like when the Melvins and
Right.
Nirvana would
Right.
be like a little bit more of like the local bands.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, in the late '80s, it
And
was.
Calvin.
Yeah, it was. Beat happening. Melvin's Nirvana. That would be a show you could see at the North Shore Surf Club, in like '89, '90. It was one of my first shows actually, which is kind of a lucky thing. Or Sun Velvet Sidewalk, that was happening. I mean, I guess Olympia's probably always had a vibrant community. I mean, my sister was going to shows at the Tropicana in like '83, '84. And she saw every sort of national amazing punk band that you'd ever want to see, from from a Black Flag to a Sun City Girls, it was just all over the place. They all came through Olympia, which is weird. It's a small town. There's one street that goes this way and one street that goes this way. I mean, when people would come to Olympia, they'd say, "Really? This is it? You have one coffee shop and you guys all see each other like 9 times a day?"
Yeah, could you maybe talk about that for a second? Like, what? Just Olympia? Well, not the coffee shop
Right.
thing, but that's fine. I mean, I lived in Bellingham for 5 years,
Yeah.
so that is a huge key to towns like this. It's crazy. But maybe just kind of describe what just like Olympia, just like as a town for like somebody who's like kind of what you were
Right.
starting to do for somebody who's never seen it.
Okay. Well, Olympia is a small town. I mean, it's got the state capital, which keeps it somewhat liberal, I think, and the Evergreen State College. So lots of people will go to Evergreen and they'll stick around and become state workers. So there's that contingent of Olympia, which makes, for more sort of liberal kids like, Toby and I, we had parents that did that same thing. They were Evergreen students that got involved with the state system. But if you just go outside of that little area in downtown Olympia, if you go out to the outlying areas like Tumwater and Lacey, it gets weird. I mean, sometimes there's people that live in Tumwater that have slight southern twangs. I mean, it's the Northwest. The Northwest is a weird place. There's some darkness in those rainy winters, I think. But I mean, Olympia is just sort of this anomaly in the midst of all of that. It's not a big city, but it's got some sort of progressive ideas about it.
What is it like just geographically?
It's beautiful. It's at the base of the Puget Sound. You've got the Olympics on one side and Mount Rainier on the other. Architecturally, it's hideous because I think most of the buildings collapsed in the 40s. There's a big earthquake. But it's a beautiful city. I mean, there's trees everywhere, and streams and parks and seagulls.
How do you think that affects the people there and inevitably the art there?
Well, I mean, I think there's always this idea, and maybe it's been said so much, it's sort of a stereotype, but there is something to be said for the rain. The rain making you stay in your house and be somewhat creative. Most people had basements when they live in punk houses, and everybody would practice there, and sometimes you'd sleep in the corner, but there were always places to hang out and play music when it was just pouring rain outside. I think that always led to a lot of creativity.
How often does it rain in Olympia?
Pretty often. From, say, November to the 4th of July, usually, I think. There was one year where it rained, I think, 60 days in a row straight. And that was pretty rough.
Just tell me about Tumwater.
Tumwater, growing up, I always thought Tumwater was terrifying. But I grew up on the west side of Olympia. And it always seemed like it was completely this backwatered sort of suburb. And I didn't really spend a lot of time there. It makes complete sense to me that people who grew up in Tumwater would be forming these amazing bands, though, in response.
Why?
Um, just because of how insane it was. I mean, their football team was like crazy good, right? Everybody knew they were undefeated and they won the state championship like every year. I don't know, 8 years in a row or something ridiculous. So all Tumwater was known for was their big burly jocks, and that was kind of terrifying. But you know, if you're not like that and you're interested in music and you're interested in ideas and movies and you know maybe you're smart because those guys were smart, are smart. You know that sort of mentality you have to act against.
You're saying Carp was smart, not the football player.
No, I'm saying Carp and Unwound. They were smart. They were smart kids.
So, other than that, how do you think they related to, or got along with, or interacted with the jocks that you're just?
I'm sure they just made fun of the jocks, and the jocks didn't understand it at all most of the time. I mean, they were really good at that, making fun of you, and you're not quite knowing if you should be offended or if maybe it was you were in on the fun.
Was that just yeah? What was their style of? Well, first let me ask. Um, did you feel like, well, like as far as like their sense of humor,
Right.
did it seem like a congealed sense of humor or three little separate senses of humor? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I think, you know, I think they had their own specialties in their in their style of humor. But I think when you put them all together, it was like this Three Stooges or something. You know, I remember one time going out to Vern's house. It was during this second Yo-Yo Go-Go or something. A bunch of us went out to Vern's house and we were playing this dice game, Kariki, that everybody played at the time. Carlos from the Peaches introduced it to us, and everybody got really obsessed with it. So we were playing Kariki. Somebody had the idea to do gravity bong hits out of the bathtub. So we did that. And then it was the first time I'd seen Scott, Jared, and Chris together for a long time. And I had totally forgotten how insane it was. And I just sat on the couch and just watched this crazy skit. Like, I was crying, laughing. It was the funniest thing I'd seen in a long time. You know, and I hadn't seen them together. I can't remember if it was after they broke up and got back together. No, it must not have been. But it was this moment, I hadn't seen them together in so long that I was like, God, they love each other so much. You know, they belong together. There was something very special about watching that happen. And it wasn't just the pot.
What were their individual humor styles like? If you could talk about them.
Chris
separately.
has always been a little more mean.
Oh, can you start? That
Yeah, I would say
yeah.
Chris is always a little more mean. He's probably making fun of you. Jared's a little nicer. He's probably not making fun of you unless you're a total jerk. And Scott never made fun of me really. So I don't know if that was just because of our friendship or because he just didn't. He must have made fun of people. He just didn't to me. So it was mostly. Well, no, it's not true. Scott used to make me hit myself. And he'd be like, why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? Over and over and over again, which was kind of awful. But he was 18.
So you're thinking maybe it was some special treatment?
Yeah, probably.
So what was Jared like as a dude, as a guy?
I didn't get to know Jared very well for a while because I think Jared's a little more shy ultimately. It was a few years until I got to know Jared, and I don't think we really got to know each other until, you know, the late 90s or something. But Jared's a really sweet person. He's really intelligent. He's hilarious, quick. I don't know, I'm being nervous. Jared is, I don't know.
What about Chris?
Chris is also very intelligent. Chris really disliked my sister and maybe vice versa. So I have sort of a skewed vision of Chris because he would constantly tell me how much he hated my sister. So that didn't lend me to like him very much for a long time. I think I got to grow to appreciate Chris a little more later. But at first I'd be like, why are you telling me how much you hate my sister? Like, she's my sister. This isn't gonna make us be friends. And I've always like, Scott, I don't think I like Chris very much. You know? But
why do you think he was doing that? It's kind of like a dead-end scenario.
I don't know what it was. I think maybe he was just sort of trying to, I don't know, maybe have me say like, yeah, she's a jerk, you know, let's be friends. I don't know what he was thinking that was a good idea to do. I don't think he was really thinking it through. I think he was just expressing himself, you know, and I would just sort of walk to the other room in the party.
What was your idea of what the band, what CART meant to Scott?
Oh, CART meant everything to Scott. When we were dating, which wasn't a very long time period, but it was 1995, 4, something like that. We were 18 and 19. And he had a list of 3 things that were most important to him, and they would change based on his mood or what was happening at the time. But they were carp, cigarettes, and me. So sometimes I'd be above cigarettes, sometimes I wouldn't be. Sometimes I'd maybe be above carp. I think that happened once or twice, but generally it went carp, Maggie, cigarettes. But it always meant everything to him. It was, you know, playing drums was everything to him. Playing music with those guys was everything to him. You know, it made me really happy when he and Jared started playing in the Whip again. I cried the first time I saw the Whip because I was like, oh, they're back together again. You know, I was sort of meant to be.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think about like the differentiation between like what you're just saying, like about playing music and playing music with those guys specifically?
Yeah. Well, I feel like they were made to play music with each other. You know, they understood each other. They might have fought. They might have driven each other crazy. But there was something in their humor and in their music that was so easy for them and so unspoken that I think it was the magic of those 3.
Yeah, where do you think that stuff comes from?
God, I don't know. You know, I mean, is it growing up together? Is it having the same reference points? Is it, you know, or is it just some sort of special magical thing where you guys just get it? I don't know. Probably some combination of that.
What was your idea of what that band gave to Scott, like, personally?
Well, I mean, I think as any time you're in a band where you're spending all your time touring or thinking about music or whatever, I mean, it gives you part of your identity. You know, it's like, that's Scotty Carp, or, you know, that's Maniac, or whatever nickname he had at the time. It was always related to Carp. You know, I mean, it was what he was constantly thinking about, what they're gonna do next, or what kind of drums does he want to have, what kind of drum set does he want to have, what, you know, when's the tour happening, you know. I mean, it was everything at that moment, it seemed like.
So that I'm getting the idea that wasn't, like, the fact that he was synonymous with it was totally cool with him.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think he was really proud to be part of Carp. I mean, that was what he loved to do. That's what he wanted to do.
And
of course, he always wanted to be a studio musician. He would talk to me about this fantasy that he had in the future, where he could play drums like, you know, John Paul Jones or whatever, like on everybody's record. He wanted to play on country records. He wanted to play drums. That was a later fantasy, though.
So, how did he feel about the drums, just specifically?
Drums were his life, you know. I mean, he thought about drums constantly. He dreamt about them. He played them everywhere, on his feet, you know, on his hands and tables. You know, that was all he wanted to do, was play drums.
Did he have other interests, or was it kind of a one-track mind? Or?
Comedy. You know, I think they watched Army of Darkness every single day in Vern's basement room for a year, maybe. You know, again, he liked to smoke. He liked movies. Movies were a passion. I think he really liked being the projectionist at the state tri. He was really into, it's interesting, he was really into sort of envisioning something and then making it happen. Like, he used to draw pictures of himself in my notebooks. This is in 1994. You know, I had like a journal on the floor, and he would start drawing pictures of himself and these tattoos that he wanted to get, that he eventually did get like 7 years later. You know, he always had these visions for what he was going to do. He was very deliberate, you know, very thoughtful.
Did he tell you about what high school was like for him?
I'm not sure we got very deep into it. You know, I think he would talk about how horrible it was going to Tumwater High School. But to be honest, if he ever told me more than that, I don't really remember. You know, I mean, I don't remember hearing stories about him getting beaten up or anything, or, you know. He was in marching band, right? Yeah.
So, what do you think? What impact do you think the Melvins had on Scott?
It was huge. Has anyone told you the story of him knocking on their door?
No.
Okay, they moved to Scott, when he was very young, they moved to Montesano. And he lived across the street, apparently, from Buzz. And went across the street and knocked on the door of their house. Just, you know, being a kid, like, just that's what he was doing. And he knocked on the door, and Buzz's mom answers. And Scott doesn't know what to do. He just is like, okay, what did I just do? He's probably like 5 or something. Doesn't know how to react to somebody opening the door. And his mom is freaking out and has just found him. Runs across the street, and she's like, Scotty, what are you doing? And apparently he starts crying and points at Buzz's mom and says, she hit me. But the mom, of course, is, you know, understands that, like, no, this lady just didn't hit you. Like, come on, sorry about that. We're going back across the street.
He's like covering up his own embarrassment.
Yeah, but that was Buzz's house. There was some foreshadowing there. Whether or not he knew it.
And so what was, like, maybe if you could even, like, back it up for a second, talk about kind of like what the Melvins kind of are in the Northwest.
Right. The Melvins are the sort of the Northwest boiled down to a sound. You know, I mean, it's like the essence of the Northwest. It's slow, it's dirgy sometimes, it's heavy, but it's musical. They were special, you know. I mean, nothing was bigger than a Melvin show in Olympia in the early 90s, probably in the late 80s as well. You know, they were kind of what every teenage boy wanted to be at the time, and girl. You know, I think that was they were the ultimate band.
And were they from a similar kind of environment?
Yes,
place,
absolutely.
setting?
Yeah, Melvins were, you know, from Montesano and Aberdeen, which is just like Tumwater. I mean, it's just like any small town that was based on logging, and logging has sort of, by that time, gone by the wayside, so they're depressed areas. You know, they're gloomy and rainy and dark and depressed.
How did Scott feel about Jared?
Scott loved Jared. Scott and Jared were, you know, best friends.
I actually interviewed George Orwell, the manager from the state.
Oh, yeah, George.
Yeah, he said the awesomest thing. He said that, he's like, well, originally, he's like, I would schedule one of them, and they would both come.
Yeah.
So I would just schedule them together because they just came together.
Yeah. They
were
cute. They were very cute. They were best friends.
What about Chris?
In my memories, Chris and Scott, they loved each other, but they were more like brothers. They would fight. they would have their moments of frustration. And, you know, I definitely think Jared and Scott fought, but I think Chris and Scott were more like brothers, where they loved each other, but they would sort of butt heads a lot.
And like kind of looking at the whole kind of like trajectory of their friendship, like we kind of talked about them like growing up, and then the kind of and then them kind of like really honing their thing and getting to enjoy it for many years, and then kind of some of the more looming things that sit in the future for their friendship. How did you kind of see? How would you kind of discuss how that moved or
between Chris and Scott in particular, or all three? Well, I mean, it's telling that I can't really remember when that story is from, that Yo-Yo Go-Go story, because I'm pretty sure that wasn't when they reunited. It was just the Yo-Yo before that. But my memory is that I hadn't seen them together. They had been fighting. So there had already been some bickering that was a little more intense than it had been. I mean, I think when I first met them, they were a really solid core unit. And I think over the years, maybe the touring, maybe just where you wanted to go with your life, or what you sort of thought for the future was, coming, or what you wanted to do, I feel like maybe there was some turmoil that began, maybe in the late, mid to late 90s, a little bit.
What effect do you think the things that Chris was going through had on Scott?
Well, you mean like, heroin, or
like big shenanigans.
Yeah, I mean like, the attempted suicide and the heroin. I think it was really, really hard on Scott. I mean, and hard on Jared. It was rough to deal with. I mean, because you're a kid and you don't really know how to deal with it. You don't know how to deal with drug abuse. You don't know how to deal with depression. You just kind of sort of laugh it off, or like, hit your buddy on the shoulder and say like, hey, I'm here for you, we love you, don't go away, or whatever. I mean, I think there was a lot of drugs in Olympia in the 90s, and there was a lot of tragedy, and who knew how to deal with it? We didn't. We were not equipped to know how to tell your friend to stop doing heroin, other than just ask them not to, and that doesn't really work. And I think there are some, real tragedies out of that. Like Kai from Tumwater. Kai was one of the smartest kids I ever met. He worshipped carp, he worshipped Unwound. He was probably 3 years younger than them or something, 2 or 3. Just died of a heroin overdose. Scott wasn't always really great at dealing with things. Sometimes he would just sort of shut off and be like, I'm going to walk away. I can't really handle this. And I actually don't know how he really dealt with it internally, how he really dealt with Chris. But, I think that love and support was always there,
What was his attitudes towards drug use?
Well, initially, Scott was pretty anti-drug use. None of us really drank very much in those early years. It wasn't like we get wasted at parties, Even when we all turned 21, we didn't really go to bars or anything in the very beginning. It wasn't until we got a little bit older that people started drinking more, and maybe there was some cocaine use, and other things came into Olympia that didn't really happen so much. Heroin was kind of always there, but sort of this other group of people that were doing it, and it hadn't really entered into our little circle until maybe the 95 or something. There was more.
So for your guys' circle, did you feel like there was like a kind of like a boundary, like these things are fine, these things
there was absolutely a boundary. There was sort of like, okay, we drink sometimes, but mostly we just like hang out till 5 a.m. like, laughing and watching stupid movies, and or running around the streets. Like, we didn't really, in that group, there wasn't a lot of intoxication, really. and when we were that young. It happened later.
So what were some of the kind of drugs and things that were kind of considered kind of, don't like off limits, like?
Well, I think probably heroin was considered off limits. Cocaine, for a while, was considered off limits. Then people welcomed it in. I think there was, but I mean, Chris always did drugs. That's the thing. Chris is like, his mouth would turn black and he'd end up in you know, the emergency room because he took too many mushrooms, the wrong kind or whatever. Like there'd always be something weird going on with Chris. He did a lot of acid. A lot of people did drink and smoke pot. But I guess it wasn't until later that really sort of the darker drugs kind of took over.
Yeah, and what is it, do you think, about those drugs that kind of make them off limits to people who want to be healthy?